Success Insight shares the stories of the people with passion and drive who make things happen in the world. Here's your host, Howard Fox.
Good morning, everybody. This is Howard Fox from the Success Insight podcast. For my co-host, Randy Ford, we hope you are having a fantastic day. Our guest on the podcast is Marie Hannon. Marie is an award-winning children's book author, and she has been writing all her life. First, kind of started with poetry, and we hope she'll share a little bit more about that background. At present, her efforts are directed towards her children's books. She is the author of a narrative story all about a boy who was afraid of the dark and how he got over it. And her newest book, published last May, is a rhyming story titled A Going Home Surprise. And this book won the Mom's Choice Awards, the reader's favorite 5-star rating. And we hope she'll chat more about that too. Marie, it is a pleasure to have you on the Success Insight podcast, and we're looking forward to learning more about you and your work. Welcome.
Well, I'm totally excited to be here today, Howard, and I want to thank you for the opportunity. I am feeling a little overwhelmed, but that's okay because my books help me as well as hopefully they help others with worries.
All right. Well, I hope the overwhelm is not being on this little old podcast, because I have no doubt here, just being able to write, you're going to also be able to share your stories about how you write and what it has meant in your life as well. So tell us, if you can, as we start on the podcast journey this morning, is what's your background? Tell us a little bit about that and how you got into writing.
Well, actually, as I think you mentioned, I've always wanted to write. I remember even when I was something like 7 years old, writing a poetry piece for school assignment. And as every student knows, eventually we all have to write papers on topical issues. When I went for my second degree, my first was a Bachelor of Science in Medical Technology. My second was a Master of Science in Urban Studies. I was fortunate enough to be given the thesis commendation, and I found out later that my thesis was actually placed in the university library as a model for other graduate students to use or review.
Let me ask you a question about that. So you're writing your thesis, and did you know the books were going to show up in the library?
Absolutely not.
I mean, the thesis?
No.
Wow, that's a surprise.
It was, I guess, just a good job. They liked it. They liked the way I put it together. They liked the research that I did.
Okay. Now, with your writing, you're speaking now from the lens of a college student, but as you were writing, I mean, you had some influence there in your writing, didn't you?
Well, I think one of the best influences I ever had in terms of writing was in college, because I had to write a lot of research papers. And then in graduate school, it was the same. And I also received comments from a writing course that I took years later in Washington, D.C. The gentleman's teacher's name was Omar Henry. Now, can you imagine O. Henry?
Oh, my God.
He would ask the class to develop sample writing, short stories, articles of interest, whatever, on a weekly basis. And then he would critique those articles. And I think through over and over and over drafting something and receiving critiques and then redrafting and so forth, I got to be better and better in my writing. And I still try to excel. I think we all can learn.
Well, I think learning how to write, learning how to listen, learning how to be in the moment, to see, that's a lifetime of thoughtful activity and desire to want to be better. And the beauty of just taking that piece of paper and that pen to it, and it's just practicing over and over again. Now, in your family, were there any influences there?
Not directly, but I learned years later, after I was married and moved away, how much my mother was involved in local writing for newspapers and story time. And she actually kept journals with poems that are just amazing to me. And years later, after the birth of our first child, she sent me a small poem that I liked, and I read it to my children. And then later, I decided to edit it a bit. It needed a new ending. It needed some changes in the verbiage, and it needed illustrations. And I did try to do illustrations. I've never viewed myself as a true artist, but that was my first indie book published. And I did that as a co-author with my mom. And it was called, it still is out there, Puffy and the Formidable Foe.
Puffy and the Formidable Foe. You know, not many writers can actually, or artists for that matter. I think I've seen it on in acting, perhaps in music, but from a writing genre, not many can say that I've co-authored a book with my mom or my dad or my brother or sister. And that's got to be pretty special.
Well, the comical part is that she really didn't anticipate that. It was just something that I wanted to do in honor of her. And on that basis, I followed through.
Fantastic. Now, are there any poems today that's from that book that still resonate for you?
Well, the overall book is a rhyming book. I've shared it with school children at Authors' Day events. And in fact, what's interesting is at that kind of an event, we would move from kindergarten to first grade to second, third, fourth, and fifth. It was an all-day event, and I presented the book to each grade level. And what I thought was most interesting is, of course, the little ones, the kindergartners and the first graders loved it, especially the word yucky. when we get to almost the end of the book, there is a word in there, yucky shampoo. And I don't want to give a spoiler alert, but they all laughed at that point. But by the time I was presenting the book to the fifth graders and asking them for comments after I had read the book to them, one young man actually offered this. He said, I think that a sequel book, another book, would be a good idea. And of course, I had thought of that myself to do eventually. And I had thought of Puffy Meets a Friend. But I asked him before I said that, do you think, you have an idea of what the title of the book should be? And exactly his thoughts, Puffy Meets a Friend. So that is another project I have on right now in the works.
Well, that is fantastic. So I think there's probably a good reason after this podcast to have you on again when you've got that book out there.
Don't commit too much because I have at least 5 in the works.
Oh my God, 5 books in the works. Well, that's actually pretty amazing. I know I have books on the shelf and they're kind of like artwork. They just sit there on the shelf. And I was a bookaholic when I was going through graduate school, and everybody recommended a book here, a book there, and they would show up on the shelf. And of course, I ran out, so they would stay on the coffee table. And then the young ladies I was dating were saying, get these books off the table. If they go on the shelf, your place is a mess. Well, I'm not dating and my place is still a mess, but I just love books. I just love the feel of them. And when you write, I'm curious about this because a lot of our other guests talk a little bit about this. How do you like to write? Do you go into a nice quiet room? Do you go to the local bookstore, library? Do you write on a computer, paper, pen? How do you write?
Well, that's a good question. And what I find interesting is that we all learn from each other. And there are many, many different writers in the same way that there are many different types of individuals. But we all learn and we all have our own way of moving forward. And for myself as a writer, I don't really plan necessarily to write a book. I'll get an idea in my mind. I may start a poem, and then based on that, I may embellish the poem later on, turn it into what these books have turned into as children's picture books and interactive learning books. And then I work towards getting it actually published so I can offer it to others. But in the meanwhile, one of the books that recently won the Mom's Choice Award, Seal of Excellence, entitled A Going Home Surprise that you mentioned at the beginning of our talk, was a poem that I published on a website that is called authorsden.com. And this was back over maybe 4 years ago.
Wow.
And some of the reviews were just very encouraging. I guess that's the way I like to write. In other words, if I have an idea, I try to develop it to the extent that I could share it with others, maybe as only a poem, not only, but maybe as a poem, and get some feedback. Because maybe it's an idea that resonates with a lot of people that would find some benefit to what I provide in the poem. And for Going Home Surprise, which is a story of a little kitten, a little lost kitten who finally finds a home, one of the reviews said, "Lovely, glad she found her forever home." Another review I had said, "An amazing story poem of a cat who was abandoned and rescued with Kathy's love." Kathy's a little girl in the story, and now enjoys being given a good chin scratch. Kudos to Kathy, a little girl with a big heart. Thank you, Anne. That's the person writing the review to me, for sharing this inspiring verse. And one other, I don't want to overload you.
Go ahead.
A wonderful you and Mitten, the kitten, will give you smiles and love for years. A wonderful story told in a great rhyming piece of poetry. So that ain't me saying it all. Those are people I probably will never meet. But they had the opportunity and took the opportunity to read my poem when I submitted it to Authors Den, just to submit, because that's really what Authors Den is about. There's no fee involved. You can subscribe for various parts of what they offer, but these reviews were totally voluntary. So I'm really indebted and grateful and inspired further. Keep going.
Most definitely. And I think that's what I love about your work and, the writing, and it's the art of creating, and where this inspiration or the insight, so there's a good play on the words for our podcast, Success Insight, is where does that insight come from? And when our work is out there, it is nice. Sometimes it's lonely. Is what we're doing meaningful? Are we making a difference in some way, both for ourselves and for the community, or even on a much larger scale? And I think when you can get acknowledgement for the work like you've just described, that informs us that we're doing the right thing. It's giving us fuel for our passion, so to speak. And I love that. Can you talk a little bit more about Going Home Surprise? And I also want to talk a little bit about your first book there, all about a boy who was afraid of the dark. But let's stick with a Going Home Surprise. And so you had this poem. It was just kind of sitting there for a number of years. What else informed you for producing this book? Was there anything else, or just kind of the creative juices were flowing and the pen was just effortlessly scratching across the paper?
Well, in retrospect, I should add, and I'm happy to do so, that I was involved in some writing classes online that were offered by a wonderful woman named Sheila Bender. And her website is writingforreal.com. And at that point, one of the assignments was to come up with a poem and something that was just of interest to us. And my daughter, Kathy, at the time, I think was probably much older than the little girl in this poem. But I recalled how Kathy had always cared for others, loved little animals, actually gave us 2 cats as adoptees while she was growing up. And one of them became the character for the poem named, Mitten. And I developed that poem for Writing It Real class. And I got some comments, and they liked the first draft of my poem, the other students and Sheila. But I think I recall Sheila's comment was, "Can you tell us a little bit more?" And so I took the poem and I developed it further. But it wasn't something that was just at the snap of a finger. It took me a while. And I didn't really, my word is cogitate on it. I didn't really cogitate all that time. But little by little, I got sort of a sense of how I wanted the poem to be, how it would sound being read. And eventually, I got to the point where I thought, yeah, I think this could go out as an indie publication. And when that happened, it was even a double trouble kind of challenge, because I had to gear the writing and the verses to the illustrations that were going to be part of the book. And that took a while also. So it was not something slam dunk for me, but I keep trying and I move forward as best I can. And the beauty, this really, heartfelt response from Mom's Choice Awards is just what propelled me to accept your invitation. I'm very honored to have a Going Home Surprise receive that seal of excellence from Mom's Choice Awards. But guess what? All About a Boy Who Is Afraid of the Dark has also been granted their official seal of excellence as well.
Fantastic.
Yeah, Puffy and the Formidable Foe has that same seal.
Fantastic. Now, talk to us a little bit about All About a Boy Who Was Afraid of the Dark. How did that come about? And I also want to hear more about the illustrations in these books. I mean, there's a number of the children's books. And I mean, in fact, I think almost all children's books have to have some illustration, because if they're geared towards kids, kids can then, with the help of whoever's reading the book to them, can interpret the words to the picture. So that is no small feat to, illustrate a book. And because the illustrator has to be in congruence with the writer, I would imagine. So tell us more about both of that.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think it is a real challenge. And as far as All About a Boy Who Is Afraid of the Dark, I think the impetus for that story was related to my training and background as a civil and workplace mediator. And I had had mediation training. I understood the concept of win-win negotiations as opposed to win-lose only. And on that basis, I just, as many other writers also have the same impetus, sat down one day and wrote out a draft. And then I would come back to it, embellish it, add to it, and so forth. But I can read a small piece from the book, if this would be a good time to do that.
Oh, I would love if you would do that. It's a fantastic, it's a wonderful gift for our audience. So thank you. Please do.
All righty. Thank you for the opportunity. As I mentioned, the book starts out basically when Patrick finds out that even though he's been afraid of things before, this time, when he's almost 2 years old, just before his second birthday, he wakes up at midnight only to learn that he's afraid of the dark. And what happens then is something that's, almost at the middle of the book. And I'll read just a small little bit.
Okay.
At first, his bottom lip poked way out. Then his two small eyebrows started to meet. Then his whole face turned into a terrible frown. Finally, Patrick cried out in a long, strong boo-hoo-hoo. Of course, this terrible crying soon woke up Patrick's big sister, Margie, whose bedroom was right next to Patrick's. Margie put on her robe, walked out into the darkened hallway, and opened Patrick's door. Margie stood there for a moment, trying to think of something to say. She had learned from Mom and Dad that it was important to talk things out and communicate in order to solve problems and get along with others. And since it was so dark, she slowly and carefully walked to Patrick's bed, sat down next to him. Then she put her arm around Patrick's shoulder, and in a very grown-up 5.5-year-old voice said, "Patrick, don't be afraid of the dark. The dark is something you sleep in, like a nice warm blanket or a soft, fluffy sleeping bag. If we didn't have the dark, it sure would be hard to sleep." Patrick thought for a moment. After hearing Margie, he stopped crying. Okay, that's it for now.
Fantastic. I was just thinking as you were reading that, I grew up with an older sister, about 17, 18 months older, and I don't think she would have done that. But I think that there's lessons learned here for little kids, especially if you're the older sibling. So that's wonderful. Thank you for sharing that.
My pleasure.
And so I am curious, you've been writing, God, nearly all your life. You've got these wonderful books, these award-winning books. You've got about 3 or 4 or 5 more books on the horizon for you. What else are you doing from a writing perspective? I mean, you've got some writing groups. Are you doing any teaching, mentoring? Do you get together with other writers to talk about your works? How do you keep the creative juices flowing and kind of give back, so to speak, to the aspiring writers out there?
I'm not sure that I view myself as the be-all guru for anything, but using Author's Den has been a real help to me because I can share drafts of poems, and there are other associate writers who take a look and read and respond and offer hints and topical comments and so forth. And I'm totally willing, as I have time, to do likewise. So it's a very interactive and common interest, the success of us all effort.
Fantastic. And I will provide a backlink on our show notes to Author's Den as well as to Writing for Real, Sheila Bender's site too, because whatever resources we can provide to help support you and other aspiring writers who think there is a book in them and would like to embark on that journey, definitely having some great resources.
Well, I really appreciate it, and thank you in advance.
So what else are you doing now in terms of you're doing the writing? Any other news regarding the books or some unanticipated happenings because of the book? I mean, you've got a cat who's very prominent in the current book. Anything around that? Just, hey, I didn't expect that to happen. I mean, the awards, perhaps this podcast, perhaps, but really on the greater landscape. Anything else that, wow, I didn't see that one coming? That's fantastic as a result of these work.
Well, if I understand you correctly, I'm gratified with the Mom's Choice Awards, and that is the most recent level of recognition that I've had. And I'm very open to working with Mom's Choice Awards. They know themselves and promote themselves as MCA, by the way. And something that I might want to share with your listeners is that the evaluation program they use is very precise, it's proprietary, and it's bound by a strict code of ethics. And they agree they will be objective. Their evaluation has no manufacturer or book printer influence. And their series of evaluators incorporate expertise from scientists, physicians, specialists, also parents, children, and educators and caregivers, because they are experts in knowing what's best for their families. And that's basically what Mom's Choice Awards does. Their executive director, for example, has told me that the MCA goal is to introduce families and educators to best-in-class products and services. And that's because MCA has a passion to help families grow emotionally, physically, and spiritually. And to me, that's just a wonderful, wonderful way to share and contribute. And I know parents and educators can be confident that the products and services that bear the MCA seal of approval are high quality and also of great value. And I'm just focusing on that. And sort of basking in that level of recognition right now. But I'll get on with it, and I won't get over it, but I'll get on with it, and I'll keep moving forward with the rest of my books.
Fantastic. And we'll work with you to get some direction on how to include the Mom's Choice Awards, the MCA Awards, in our show notes as well. As I was preparing for the interview, it's always nice to learn other things, something new that I hadn't expected about our guest. And I see that you've taken up a new hobby. I wonder if you could share a little bit about that.
Well, that's thanks to my daughter, my younger daughter, Kathy, and she just brought me an orchid plant the other day. Well, not just the other day, about 2 or 3 weeks ago. And I guess I'm turning into an orchid mommy because the orchid plant she gave me had 3 blossoms. And I diligently followed through with guidance to keep them in a sunny, not too sunny place, make sure the humidity level was up. I mean, I felt like I was really an orchid mommy taking care of these little baby blossoms. And lo and behold, all 3 have blossomed in the last week. So, and I've taken pictures and shared them with Kathy, and we're all sort of having a fun time with orchid growing, at least for now.
Fantastic. Anne-Marie, in the few minutes that we have left, one of the features of our show is we call it an insight to go. It's where we ask our guests if there's an idea, a quote, some success tip, a company, an organization, etc., that they would like to share with our audience. And it can be fun, it can be serious, but what kind of insight to go can you share with our listeners?
Well, recently I was able to learn of a new Harvard study in the Harvard Review.
Okay.
And it dealt with the issue of mindfulness and perfectionism, and the fact that nowadays it might be better just to move forward with an idea, with a plan, with a concept, with a book. And if it's not absolutely perfect, it can be made more perfect later on, but not to feel compelled by perfection. And in addition, looking at the idea that years ago, Harvard promoted a study on the child in the American culture. And it was found that when they did the study and gave young children positive comments on a regular, periodic, recurring basis, those children excelled far more than, unfortunately, a situation where the youngsters in the study were not given that same level of encouragement, positive reinforcement, and level of recognition. So beyond that, if you ask for a quote of the day, I recently ran across a very good one that I was not aware of the originator, but a friend let me know that recently as well. And basically it said, I never lose, either I win or I learn. And I think that's a very compelling quote. And I'd be happy and am happy to share that with your listeners as well.
We truly appreciate that. And who is that quote attributed to?
Apparently, Nelson Mandela.
Wow, Nelson Mandela. So if we all have the top 10 lists, or if somebody could go back in time to meet, I would probably say, if I had to count to five fingers on my hand, he would be definitely one individual that I would love to go back and just have a conversation with and have lunch, and such a powerful, inspiring person. And so thank you for sharing that quote. Anne-Marie, before we kind of sign off for today, if our listeners would like to learn more about you and your work, where are the best places for them to do that?
Well, I'm on Facebook, and I would be happy to entertain any requests to be friends on Facebook. If someone would send that invitation or that request to me and simply explain that they happen to be a writer also. If they are a writer of children's books, I think that probably focuses most directly into what my capability would be for responding in a favorable way. Obviously, authorsden.com/Anne Marie Hannon would be another place to locate me.
Okay, fantastic. And we'll provide the backlinks on our show notes to your Facebook site, authorsden.com/Anne-Marie Hannon. And we're also going to provide the backlinks to your author's page on Amazon. Anne-Marie, thank you so much for taking time out of your day to join us on a Success Insight podcast. It has been a joy, and just love to learn more about you and your work and really the impact that you as a children's book writer and can have through your words and the illustrations, the pictures, and what can happen in the lives of young kids that through their parents or guardians and siblings who are reading books to them. And so thank you for making that kind of a difference. We really appreciate you being on the show today.
Well, it's been my pleasure, and I definitely want to say I strongly endorse what you do and believe you are doing a great job professionally with all of the podcasts you offer that span a range of interests and contributions. Keep up the great work.
There you have it, folks. We have been chatting with Anne-Marie Hannon. She is the award-winning children's book author of All About a Boy Who Was Afraid of the Dark and How He Got Over It. And her most recent publication is a rhyming story titled A Going Home Surprise. Both have received the Mom's Choice Awards. And I would encourage you to check out the show notes and learn more about Anne-Marie and the Author's Den, as well as Writing for Real. Visit her Facebook. And also, again, we're going to provide those links on Amazon. So that's it for today. Wherever you are, whatever you're doing, go out there and have a phenomenal day. And we'll see you on the next episode of the Success Insight podcast. Take care now. All right, folks. So this is Howard again. And I was just chatting with Anne-Marie, as I usually do right after the podcast is over. And I want to share in the spirit of full disclosure that at the start of the podcast, when she first came on the line, I apologized because I have a cold and I have been drinking chicken broth, which I have made, homemade chicken broth. I have a nice cup of tea with a nice slice of ginger in it. And I thought for sure I was going to be okay. But then yesterday it decided to creep back up and I have been sniffling and sneezing all day. And I have been doing my best not to sniffle and sneeze while I was doing the podcast with Anne-Marie. And so as we signed off, she graciously gifted me with a poem she had written. And I believe she wrote it last night in anticipation of this interview today. So I thought, now that you've read this poem to me, we've got to go back on and record it. So this is Anne-Marie's poem that she's going to read. So Anne-Marie, take it away.
Okay, Howard, and let all your listeners know this is because I really care about your speedy recovery. Got it?
Got it.
Here's the poem. I caught the flu. It made me blue. I didn't know what to do. So I stayed in bed and wrapped my head. I felt I was coming unglued. My temperature soared with my mind in a quagmire. Just total panic, like a horrible nightmare. I had put off getting my flu shot, of course, and for that, I was in total remorse. I realized that flu shots don't guarantee a season of symptoms that's totally free, but I didn't believe it could be so terrible with fever, stomach aches, and other unmentionables. Now, I am better. I understand my mistake. So when next year beckons to the pharma, I'll make a one-stop trip to get what it takes. I'm sure it will be an inoculation or two, being absent from flu shots since pre-2002. I'm sure I will manage without too much pain if an early flu shot ensures that I gain an edge on the season. And if that's all it takes, I can avoid being bedridden with terrible, horrible, maniacal, uncontrollable, despicable, and may I add, totally non-glam and icky fever, and aches. And that's in tribute to your strength during your illness right now, Howard.
Oh, thank you so much. I think that's absolutely wonderful. And I am confident that our listeners will appreciate that. And now that the show is going to be officially over, I'm going to head over to the store and get another box of Kleenex or Puffs with aloe. I learned that years ago. You got to get it with aloe.
Good going. Hope you have a speedy recovery.
Fantastic. So, Anne-Marie, thank you again. And that was fantastic. Thank you.
Success Insight is a production of Fox Coaching and First Story Strategies. Find us online, successinsightpodcast.com.